Oh, I didn't ask you. I hope you don't mind. The meeting is going to be recorded, but just for the purpose of our research group.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's good. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we are going to begin. We are going to begin with our next panel in this meeting. For the folks that are joining specifically for this meeting, this is part of a larger meeting. But anyway, the subject, our speaker today is Dr. Herman Westerink, and as Dr. Leonardo Niro is going to respond, and I'm going to chair this meeting. My name is Richard Tyson Simanki. I'm a member of the this research network for the history and philosophy of the knowledge and the human sciences. Our research group network that is organizing this event. I'm professor of history and philosophy of psychology at the Federal University of Juiz de Fora in Brazil, and also visiting professor at the University of Exeter in UK, which also participates in the organization of this meeting. Well, our speaker, and I'm very honored to introduce him, is Dr. Herman Westerink. He is an endowed professor and associate professor in metaphysics and philosophical anthropology at the Center for Contemporary European Philosophy at the Radboud University, Nijmegen, in the Netherlands. Herman, he did his PhD at the University of Groningen and wrote his professorial dissertation, his habilitation, at the University of Vienna. And he has published many books and articles on Freud and psychoanalysis and subjectivity and religion. Amongst other works, he published a monograph on Freud's theories of the sense of guilt in 2009, in A Dark Trace, Sigmund Freud on the Sense of Guilt, in the Leuven University Press. Another monograph on the first edition of Freud's Three Essays on the Theory of Sexuality in 2021, in collaboration with Philip van Hout, titled Reading Freud's Three Essays on the Theory of Sexuality from Pleasure to Object, at Routledge, and also published a monograph on Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality in 2019. I'm not sure, I believe this monograph only exists in Dutch, if
Yeah.
I'm,
Yeah.
and more recently, he published a monograph on Freud's Metaphysics of Trauma. It's his book. It's recently published, also in collaboration with Philippe van Hout. Its title is Seduction, Drive, and Repetition, Freud's Metaphysics of Trauma, at the Leuven University Press. So I believe Herman's going to talk to us a little bit about the ideas in this book today. And to respond to Dr. Westling's speech, we have Dr. Leonardo Niro. He's a PhD in psychoanalytic studies from the University College London, UCL. He's a former professor of the Department of Psychosocial and Psychoanalytic Studies at the University of Essex from 2013 to 2024, where he was course director of the MA in Psychoanalytic Study and led the creation of DBA Psychosocial and Psychoanalytic Study, which he also directed from 2016 to 2018. He was also the organizer of an international research group in history of psychoanalysis, and is currently a visiting professor at the Department of History of Science at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm not sure, currently or about to be, about something like that. He's author of many academic works on the history of psychoanalysis and its relationship with 19th century psychology, neurophysiology, and life sciences in general. So without any more delay, Dr. Westerink was going to talk to us about the subject trauma and the limits of psychoanalysis, reading beyond the pleasure principle. Herman, thank you so much for being here today with us, and you have the word.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Let me start by thanking you, Richard, for the kind invitation to discuss with you my recent work on psychoanalysis, and more in particular Freud's theories of trauma. But let me also start by saying that until October 2022, my research was in close and intense collaboration with my former colleague, Professor Philippe van Houten, who passed away exactly 1 year ago, 3 years ago, in this time of year. Since 2013, the year in which I joined the Department of Metaphysics and Philosophical Anthropology at the University of Nijmegen, Philippe van Houten and I embarked on a joint project, namely Freud's theory of sexuality, or theories of sexuality, and the way this theory developed in the course of time. So we focused attention on the 1905 edition of the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, and the many additions Freud made in the following editions from 1910, 1915, 1920, and 1924. Richard already mentioned the book that came out of this project in 2021. Now, one of the central claims in our studies on that text of Freud, the 3 essays, is that the first version of the 3 essays can be read as a most radical version, as probably the most radical version, in which Freud presents us a non-oedipal and even non-objectal theory of infantile sexuality. This radical theory, or at least potentially radical, is nuanced in the later versions, maybe also somewhat corrected, by the systematic introduction of a developmental perspective and the gradual oedipalization of the theory of sexuality, in the sense that Freud adds sections in which he argues that object choice is an aspect of infantile sexuality. In the context of our engagement with the 3 essays, we obviously also paid attention to Freud's motives for developing a theory of sexuality in the first place. One important motive, and maybe the most important one, can be traced back to his seduction theory, his first trauma theory. That is, his first psychological theory of psychic trauma, developed in the years 1895-1897. In this seduction theory, Freud articulated a notion of trauma in 2 phases. There's a first sexual experience in infancy, which as such does not have an immediate traumatic effect. It is only through a second sexual experience in puberty or early adulthood, that is to say, in a period in which the person has knowledge of sexual organ functions and sexual relations, that the first experience is reinterpreted, receives a new meaning, and becomes traumatic. By way of example, we referred to the case of Emma Eckstein, as Freud briefly presents it in the project for scientific psychology. When Emma is 8 years old, she is sexually assaulted by a grocer in a grocery shop. This event does not have an immediate pathogenic effect, but only becomes traumatic nachträglich, afterwards, through a second experience 4 years later, that is to say, at the beginning of puberty. Again, she enters a shop, sees 2 men laughing, and has an anxiety attack. The laughing of the men triggered a memory of the grinning of the grocer. Again, this interpretation of the first experience is possible because of the fact that Emma is now in puberty, is becoming sexually mature, and has now knowledge of sexual functions and strivings. I will not further go into details here because I was actually moving towards more comments on the book that has recently been published, Seduction, Drive, and Repetition. But this is all by means of introduction, so I hope you don't mind. Now, the main reason why Freud allegedly abandoned this seduction theory in 1897 was because it presupposed the asexuality of the child. The seduction theory was in accordance with the contemporary sexological literature when affirming that only from puberty onwards a person can be considered a proper sexual being. Freud, however, had to abandon this reference to asexuality because of the discovery of sexual activities in childhood, as confirmed notably through the study of the perversions and obsessional neuroses. Freud was now, you could say, forced to develop a theory of infantile sexuality that would have to be articulated in terms different from adult sexuality. The child is a sexual being, but this sexuality is very different from the way adult sexuality is organized. But does this step towards a theory of infantile sexuality mark really the definitive abandonment of trauma theory, of the seduction theory? In most secondary literature, this is assumed with a reference to the introduction of the Oedipus complex. But Freud does not introduce an Oedipal sexual theory in 1905, in the first edition of the Three Essays. The concept of the Oedipus complex is only first introduced in 1910, and the full-blown Oedipalization of theory only takes place from the 1920s onwards. In other words, our research on Freud's theory of sexuality raised the question about the status of trauma theory in Freud's work. If Freud does not introduce a theory of the Oedipus complex after the alleged abandonment of the seduction theory, what then exactly happens to his trauma theory? After we had finished our joint monograph on the various versions of the Three Essays and the development of Freudian thinking on sexuality, Philippe and I embarked on a new project in late 2019, the study of Freud's theories of trauma and the vicissitudes, you could say, of the seduction theory. And this resulted in a monograph published in Dutch in 2022, and this is now recently published, translated in English. I can also add that after this project, which we actually already finished in 2022, Philippe and I decided to embark on a new project, which would be a close reading, basically, of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which is a chapter in this book, the Seduction, Drive, and Repetition book. But we thought there is more to say about this text, so we wanted to write a monograph on that text. That didn't happen as a joint project, but I can mention that I've just finished the book manuscript on that text, and I've submitted it to a publisher. It will be published next year. In this lecture, I will first present the general argument that we developed in our joint monograph, Seduction, Drive, and Repetition. And in the second part of this lecture, I will make some notes on Beyond the Pleasure Principle as a text in which the topic of trauma, and more particular, the phenomenon of traumatic neurosis, leads Freud towards the limits, and probably beyond the limits of psychoanalysis. Hence also the title of my lecture for today. There is indeed enough evidence to assume that Freud had not completely abandoned the seduction theory in 1897. In Three Essays, for example, he writes that he probably exaggerated the frequency or importance of abuse and consequently overrated the importance of seduction in comparison to the factors of sexual constitution and development. This reference to constitution is crucial here. Trauma and sexuality can not only be understood from the psychological impact of infantile and puberal encounters with adult sexuality, one also has to consider constitutional factors involved. From now on, Freud determines the relationship between inherited constitution and accidental events as a complementary series in which the diminishing intensity of one factor is balanced by the increasing intensity of the other. At both the extremes of the series, cases are possible that are exclusively determined by one or both accidental or hereditary elements. In other words, the seduction theory, already in 3 essays, is not abandoned, but needs to be complemented, says Freud, with a theory of the sexual constitution. This step is connected to the discovery of infantile sexuality through the study of perversions and obsessional neurosis in particular. It is this step that leads Freud towards a more systematic inquiry into infantile sexuality and the physiological processes that define it. I quote Freud, "The factors of constitution and heredity necessarily gained the upper hand once more, but there was this difference between my views and those prevailing in other quarters, that on my theory, the sexual constitution took the place of a general neuropathic disposition." In other words, Freud does not turn attention towards Oedipal fantasies, but to the constitutional and hereditary factors in the etiology of the psychoneuroses, without denying the significance of traumatic experiences. The re-evaluation of hereditary and constitutional elements does not imply that all references to seduction disappear from Freud's theory. Both in theoretical texts and in case studies Freud released after the publication of the 3 essays, such events explicitly play a crucial role. What we find here is that the effects or the effectiveness of trauma can only be understood from an interaction with hereditary and constitutional factors. There is therefore every reason to assume that Freud did not so much abandon his original seduction theory as to adapt it and expand it in relation to these factors of constitution and heredity. So in our book, we developed this hypothesis through a reading of Freud's major case studies, Dora, the Red Man, and the Wolfman. And we argue that these case studies should and cannot be simply read as studies in which Freud develops, explores, and applies an Oedipal theory. They can be understood, to the contrary, as inquiries into the interplay between constitutional and accidental factors in the etiology of the psychoneuroses. For example, in the Dora case, it is the pronounced preference for oral experiences of pleasure, the power of the oral drive component, and the excessive reaction to disgust towards the excremental that are characteristic of Dora's sexual constitution. Her hysteria should be understood from a collaboration between traumatic, accidental, and hereditary factors. I quote, "In neurotics, their sexual constitution, under which the effects of heredity are included, operates in combination with any accidental influences in their life which may disturb the development of normal sexuality." In his analysis of Dora, Freud clearly indicates that he wants not only to confirm the theory of seduction, but also actually wants to adjust it. And this adjustment concerns the relation between accidental events and the sexual constitution. Indeed, Freud's discussion does not stop with Dora's traumatic experiences that occur shortly before or after puberty. Instead, he searches for the childhood sexual traumas upon which Dora's pathology is based. And these childhood traumas are not defined in terms of seduction only, but now result from an interplay between accidental factors such as hearing the sexual activity of her parents, and constitutional factors such as her strong oral libido. The temporality of the trauma is here not only way more complex than in the original theory of seduction, but also no longer founded in an asexual childhood, as for example was still the case in Emma. In this way, Freud reconciles the original theory of seduction with the discovery of a polymorphic perverted constitution. Let me make a brief note here on the concept of seduction, or better, the German concept of Verführung, because that's the actual word, of course, Freud uses. It should be noted here that the concept of Verführung was never limited to sexual abuse or assault only. Verführung in Freud's work primarily refers to a deflection, a derailment, or deviation from a presupposed normal course. An event or impression can be called traumatic when it provokes effects that lead a person away from what could have been, or maybe should have been, a normal development. Whether such event or impression has a diverting traumatic impact, according to Freud, largely depends on two constitutional factors. The first is precocious sexual maturity, that is, the set of perverse sexual activities developed during a period in which genital organization has not yet been developed, and reaction formations have not yet been completed. And the second factor is increased pertinacity or susceptibility to fixation. Early sexual experiences make such a deep impression that they lead to compulsion to repeat them, such that they can be said to be a trajectory for a whole lifetime. In other words, Freud's concept of Verführung allows for a theory of derailment and diversion that does not only consider accidental experiences, but also includes constitutional and hereditary factors. In our book, we argue that Freud's Verführungstheory is indeed not abandoned in his major case studies. It is complemented with a theory of the sexual constitution. From about 1910 onwards, and through his debate with Jung, it is the constitution that now becomes a new field of inquiry. More precise, Freud becomes interested in the way the sexual constitution, and notably certain reaction formations and typical object relational patterns, notably Oedipal ones, is itself the result of ancient traumatic experiences. Totem and Taboo can be seen as the first systematic inquiry into the traumatic origins of our psychic constitution. In Totem and Taboo, Freud argues from a clinical perspective that a primal traumatic experience had lasting transgenerational effects, the killing and devouring of the admired rival father, and the first spontaneous reaction formations of remorse and guilt. That this traumatic experience could have lasting effects on humanity, Freud explains by referring to a Lamarckian notion of inheritance of acquired characteristics. About this, he writes, a part of the problem seems to be met by the inheritance of psychical dispositions, which, however, need to be given some sort of impetus in the life of the individual before they can be roused into actual operation. The reactions to the primal murder become a historical acquisition that consists not of the memory of the murder, but of the set of psychological reactions to it. What is inherited is not the memory of the Oedipal father, but the Oedipal schemata, in which, for example, the fear of castration is associated with the father figure, and guilt is associated with aggression against the father. This is confirmed in the case of the Wolfman, when Freud, towards the end of the study, refers to inherited Oedipal schemata that co-determine the way the Wolfman interprets his dream of the wolves. It must be the father who is the castrator, and not the women who had actually threatened the little Wolfman with castration. This inquiry into the prehistory of sexual constitution is continued in Overview of the Transference Neuroses from 1915. The central thesis here is that the psychoneuroses bear witness to the psychical developmental history of the human beings, based on the psychoanalytic insight into the time and phase of sexual development in which the various neuroses, through fixation, appear in the individual life. Freud reconstructs the evolutionary origin of those neuroses and their precipitation in the human constitution. He argues that the primordial history can be seen as a series of traumatic, partly sexual, partly non-sexual experiences that give rise to several physiological and psychical reaction formations that would subsequently be inherited in the form of fixations and reaction patterns as constitution. Together, the successive phases in primordial history form the hereditary dispositions that are repeated in the etiology of the neuroses at the individual level. What Freud refers to as constitution or hereditary factors in the etiology of the neuroses are in fact factors that can themselves be traced back to series of traumatic experiences. Again, we think this shows that Freud did not abandon the trauma theory in 1897, but instead expanded and broadened it by turning attention to the human constitution as characterized by the impact of prehistoric traumata. From these texts, we can conclude that Freud regards the human being as a traumatized animal, an animal whose physical and psychological development from prehistoric times has been disturbed, interrupted, inhibited, and deflected. Through prehistoric traumatic experiences, human beings have acquired certain characteristics that will be repeated in every individual. What we would generally consider normal sexual development in humans is essentially from its beginning a disturbed sexual development. This, Freud argues, is notably evidenced in the diphasic structure of sexual development and the temporality of trauma itself, a first infantile sexual period, then a period of latency, and then the sexual transformations in puberty. But also the significance of the Oedipus complex can be understood from these inquiries into phylogenesis, and not the other way around. In other words, the inquiry into phylogeny can be seen as a decisive step in the gradual Oedipalization of Freudian theory. Now, what is Freud's main argument for applying his insights from clinical practice in the domain of phylogeny and the historical acquisition of characteristics? The mention of inherited acquired psychical characteristics in Totem and Taboo is a reference to the contemporary psycho-Lamarckist theories with which Freud was familiar and to which he gave his own interpretation. In Freud's version of Lamarckism, the acquisition of characteristics is not based on the functional use or disuse of organs and body parts, but on the impact of external stimuli, traumata, and the enforced physiological and psychical modifications that result from this, and that are passed on to the next generation. Freud turns to Lamarck in order to argue for the inheritance of the effects of trauma. In this same period, we also find the first explicit references to Ernst Haeckel's biogenetic law. Ontogeny is the abbreviated and accelerated repetition of phylogeny. It was a well-known law in theory, in evolutionary theory, biology at the time. Ernst Haeckel is its most famous most famous for formulating this law, but the law was quite generally and quite broadly accepted also by the teachers that Freud knew from his student years when he was a medical student and when he was working in the zoological lab in Trieste. But he uses this law, the biogenetic law, as a principle applicable to psychic life. This law, or recapitulation theory, will play a crucial role in Freud's arguments in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Why is Freud keen to integrate this law into his metapsychological inquiries in phylogeny? I think the biogenetic law we can say that the biogenetic law states that the development of each individual from embryo to adult repeats in an abbreviated and accelerated form the evolution of the species. For Freud, this means that the individual repeats the complete history of interactions between constitutional factors and newly acquired characteristics that together produce the elementary physiological properties and psychological organizations defining each individual. However, not only does the biogenetic law express that each individual organism must repeat the history of the species, it also expresses the idea that at each stage of development, a previous stage is abandoned and will nevertheless persist and can even be re-established through regression. Haeckel thus offers a theory in which progress and the appearance of new species in evolution does not cancel out the remainders of the most primitive forms and associated tendencies. This includes the traces of historical trauma and its effects. At least that's the way that Freud uses the theory. Phylogenetically inherited traces can be individually repeated with pathogenic effects. Furthermore, the biogenetic law implies that since each individual repeats the development of an entire evolutionary lineage, all regulatory mechanisms, functions, and tendencies valid for all organisms in that lineage must also apply to the individual, and vice versa. All fundamental, that is constitutional, regulatory mechanisms and functions found in the individual organism must also be present in all organisms in the same lineage, up to the point in evolution where these were first acquired. In other words, not only does phylogeny provide insight in ontogeny, but the law also allows for the reverse, the study of individual physiological, psychological characteristics provides knowledge of the evolutionary lineage. The recapitulation theory thus provides a crucial argument for extending the study of the fundamental aspects of human beings to all organic life. And that is exactly what Freud will be doing in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud refers to Haeckel's biogenetic law at a crucial point in the text, having argued that the compulsion to repeat has an instinctual character. He states that we cannot escape the suspicion that we may have come upon a track of a universal attribute of the drives, and perhaps of all organic life in general. What follows is the definition of drive as, I quote, an urge inherent in organic life to restore an earlier state of things. Freud defines drive not as a factor impelling towards change and development, but as an expression of the conservative nature of living substance. The argument for this claim about the characteristics of all organic life does not depend so much on concrete examples of the migration of certain fish to their spawn grounds or the yearly migratory flights of birds. His main argument centers on the biogenetic law. I quote, "We are quickly relieved of the necessity for seeking for further examples by the reflection that the most impressive proofs of there being an organic compulsion to repeat lie in the phenomena of heredity and the facts of embryology. We see how the germ in a living animal is obliged in the course of its development to recapitulate, even if only in a transient and abbreviated fashion, the structures of all the forms from which it sprung, instead of proceeding quickly by the shortest path to its final shape. Now, this is almost a direct definition of the recapitulation theory in order to establish a relation between the compulsion to repeat he finds in certain patients towards a very general theory of the conservative nature of all drives in all organic life. Right? And the only argument he gives is the biogenetic law. With a reference to the biogenetic law, we have made the step to beyond the pleasure principle, and we need to take a few steps back in order to contextualize what I've just said about Freud's references to the biogenetic law as a crucial argument in establishing a link between the compulsion to repeat found in individuals on the one hand, and repetition as characteristic of all drives on the other hand. We know that in this text, Freud regularly discusses evolutionary theories and contemporary popular biology in the context of his speculations on the fundamental principles that define organic life. We also know that Freud wrote this text in two phases. A first version was written and finished by April 1919. Freud decided then not to publish this text and started reworking it in the summer of 1920, so more than a year later. This resulted in the published version of the same year. It is only in the second version of the text that we find the sixth chapter, in which Freud famously introduces the new conceptuality of life drives and death drives. I do not want to delve into a very detailed analysis of what prompted Freud to consider the first version of the text, to reconsider the first version of the text, and to introduce a new drive theory. The main reasons appear to be the following. First, when bringing to the fore theory in which all drives, the sexual drives and the self-preservative drives, are conservative and aim to restore previous state, Freud saw himself confronted with the danger of a new drive monism. After all, the idea that all drives have the same aim undermines a drive dualism introduced to account for psychic conflict. Second, when both the conservative drives and the pleasure principle aim at the elimination of tension, there is no real beyond the pleasure principle, and there is no answer to the question of why there can be repetition of unpleasurable situations when all tendencies and functions in the organism serve the same purpose of reduction of tension and excitation. The compulsion to repeat unpleasurable situations cannot be explained, and the production of tension must be attributed to external disturbing and diverting influences. So one of the arguments in the book is that Freud, at the beginning of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, introduces the problem, namely that he has always asserted that the psychic apparatus is automatically regulated by the pleasure principle, and that means that there is an automatic, that the psychic apparatus automatically seeks the reduction of tension and excitation, either towards a homeostatic or towards a point of zero tension. And he finds, of course, also famously, clinical examples that contradict this position, right? And the most famous one is the war neuroses, the traumatic neurotic patients that compulsively repeat their traumatic experiences. But at the moment when Freud in the fifth chapter argues that the drives are conservative and seek to return to a state in which there is no tension and all excitation is eliminated, that life, as he famously says, aims at death. then there is no difference, there is no proper distinction between the aim of all the drives and the aim of the pleasure principle. In short, there is nothing in the organism that can explain the repetition of unpleasurable traumatic experiences. And so there's a problem at the end of chapter 5. A drive monism, and you could say the impossibility to answer the question that Freud had put to the fore at the beginning of the text. What I would like to highlight here further is that Freud's speculations on the origin and evolution of organic life in that first version of the text can be seen as the quite radical outcome of a train of thought that starts after the alleged abandonment of the seduction theory. From the study of the sexual constitution in 3 essays, Freud starts to inquire in the historical developments that help to explain the various inherited and constitutional components of psychic life, and also physiological traits. From about 1910 onwards, Freud includes the study of phylogeny in his work in a more systematic way. What are the principles at work in phylogeny and ontogeny that help us explain change, either in terms of progress or derailment? This brings him close to the fundamental debates in the contemporary evolutionary biology. The other thing I would like to highlight here is the importance of the clinical interest in traumatic neuroses, or more concrete, the war neuroses. We know that Freud's starting point in the first version of Beyond the Pleasure Principle for his questioning of the pleasure principle as the principle of automatic regulation of the psychic apparatus is triggered by a number of daily and clinical observations of the compulsion to repeat unpleasurable situations. He had already observed this phenomena in melancholia, but a new pressing issue forces him to consider this problem more carefully: the traumatic neuroses, the traumatized, shell-shocked soldiers that relive the horrors of the trenches. How is such compulsion to repeat highly unpleasurable situations possible if the psychic apparatus aims at pleasure, that is, the elimination of excitation? It is this question that in chapter 4 and 5 of Beyond the Pleasure Principle leads Freud to apply the biogenetic law in order to speculate and theorize in 2 directions. First, he seeks to shed light on the individual attempts to erect defensive measures against the influx of huge amounts of drive energy from a phylogenetic perspective. In this train of thought, one could argue Freud explores the hereditary and constitutional factors in their significance for the etiology of the traumatic neuroses. And second, he uses the model of the traumatic neuroses for speculating on the origins of life and the significance of traumatic events for the evolution of the species. And here we find an extension of the clinical perspective that surpasses the realm of human beings and now includes all organic life. In other words, the clinical perspective becomes a bioanalytical perspective in which the psychopathologies are informative about general principles and mechanisms at work in the evolution of organic life. In the 1919 version of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, the 1919 version of Beyond the Pleasure Principle can be seen as Freud's major contribution to a joint project with Sandor Ferenczi that started shortly after the publication of Totem and Taboo, study of phylogenetic determinants of ontogenetic processes, notably those concerning the sexual functions. This is what Ferenczi will call metabiology or bioanalysis. As Ferenczi will make clear in his most important contribution to this joint project, bioanalysis is the alternative to biologism. It does not seek to found psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic theory on solid scientific grounds, but it seeks to transfer psychoanalytic concepts to organic phenomena and to identify the psychic principles and processes manifest in all organic matter and their development or evolution. In chapter 4 of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud famously discusses the vicissitudes of the most simplified life form, an undifferentiated vesicle that merely consists of a sensitive surface. The vesicle is continuously, repeatedly vulnerable to the destructive traumatization. The first living substance is a traumatized substance. According to Freud, this vesicle would continue to have a very short lifespan in a hostile environment if it would not be provided with a protective shield. And indeed, Freud argues this protective shield, an inorganic crust, will be formed in reaction to continuously modifying external stimuli. The evolution of organic life can be thought of as survival of the traumatized. The survival goes hand in hand with internal stabilization. The protective shield is the condition for the prolongation of the vesicle's life and for the first internal differentiations that as such form the foundation for later more complex psychical and physiological systems. Freud's reason for introducing these speculations on the most elementary life form and its first modifications is that these shed light on the constitutional factors and fundamental mechanisms that play a role in the traumatic neuroses. From the speculations on the vesicle's first differentiations, Freud concludes that consciousness first arises in the perceptual system as a layer that is in fact part of the first protective shield established against incoming external stimuli. The reaction formations of the living organism against the influx of stimuli from the outside provide Freud with an evolutionary argument for identifying free conditions for all later modifications that will determine the actual advancement and development towards more complex organisms. First, the protective shield is still vulnerable to breaches and therefore traumatization from the outside. Secondly, the formation of the protective shield explains why consciousness is relatively unprotected from amounts of drive stimuli that act upon the psychic systems from the inside. And thirdly, the formation of a protective shield is the most basic condition for the possibility of psychic organization. According to Freud, this is informative for the traumatic neuroses. In these neuroses, one finds a collapse of all protective and receptive systems and the paralysis of the regulatory psychic functions, such as the pleasure principle. The traumatic neuroses and the compulsion to repeat unpleasurable situations are then to be understood first as the inevitable effect of trauma and the collapse of psychic functions, and secondly, as attempts to restore the most fundamental protective measurements. The fright dreams of these patients, Freud argues, have the task to master the incoming drive energy by binding these energy to representations of concrete danger located in space and time. They are meant to produce the preparedness for anxiety. In these trains of thought on the analogies between the vesicle and the shell-shocked patient, the first differentiations and internal organizations in the vesicle are meant to shed light on the etiology of the traumatic neuroses and the conditions for recovery. In chapter 5 of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud uses the biogenetic law to expand his clinical perspective to the domain of all organic life. In this chapter, it is the traumatic neuroses that provide the model for thinking the origins of evolution of living substances into ever more complex organic forms. The origin of life is described in terms of a traumatic event and its immediate reactive after effects. I quote, "The attributions of life were at some time evoked in inanimate matter by the action of a force of whose nature we can form no conception." And he continues, "The tension which then arose in what had hitherto been an inanimate substance, endeavored to cancel itself out. In this way, the first drive came into being, the drive to return to the inanimate. And like in the case of the traumatic neuroses, I quote, the phenomena of organic development must be attributed to external disturbing and diverting influences. And every modification which is thus imposed upon the course of an organism's life is accepted by the conservative organic drives and stored up for further repetition. The creation of life from inanimate matter can be described in terms of a violent mechanical shock that produces effects and reactions analogous to the traumatic neuroses. The first impact of a force that created the first living substance is the first disturbance in an endless series of disturbances. Freud's statement that decisive external influences altered the first living substance in such a way as to oblige the still surviving substance to diverge ever more widely from its original course of life, and to make ever more complicated detours before reaching its aim of death, shows that the development of organic life towards ever more complicated life forms can be described from the perspective of, and in analogy to, the psychopathologies. The use of the terms Ablenkungen and Umwege in this context is significant. It connects beyond the pleasure principle to the seduction theory. For Freud, life is disturbed and derailed matter, you could say, seduced matter, but seduce, Verführung is the better word. Seduction is not the right term. While the drives seek to return to the inanimate, the animate to the inanimate, it is external forces that enforce new modifications that complicate and prolong life. Changes in the evolution of organic life are deflections and detours provoked by outside influences. Freud's cosmology, we argue in the book, turns out to be a traumatology. Life itself arises from traumatic shock. Evolution is driven by reactions to traumatic disturbances, producing deflections that, acquired as such, will define the developments and characteristics repeated in each generation. In this first version of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud situates himself in a broader debate on mechanistic and historical, that is, evolutionary biological approaches that seek to explain change, development, and progress in phylogeny and ontogeny. In this context, Freud radically rejects any reference to an inner formative or vitalist principle. Organic life resists change and progress. The fundamental conflict Freud identifies from his inquiries into the traumatic neuroses and the undifferentiated vesicle is that between inner tendencies and functions that seek the elimination of excitation and the external disturbing forces that produce new modifications. These speculations are Freud's major contribution to the bioanalytical project with Sandor Ferenczi. What Freud and Ferenczi add to discussions in biology and evolutionary theory from their clinical perspective is a critique of any reference to an expedient force directing life in general and individual organisms towards a predetermined set of ends. Freud and Ferenczi, in contrast, will prioritize trauma and the relative ineffectiveness or effectiveness of reaction formations. We can understand why Ferenczi writes that solely and exclusively psychoanalysis can provide the psychological knowledge to the field of biology, because it does not rely on a notion of progressive striving towards whole. From what we have said so far, we can begin to understand how Freud's evolutionary and biological speculations create new theoretical problems. A tendency towards drive monism, I already mentioned it. A train of thought that leads to the conclusion that there is actually no beyond the pleasure principle, since both the drives and the higher psychic systems regulated by the pleasure principle all seek elimination of excitation. Also, in this view, a neurotic conflict is no longer an inner conflict, but a conflict between individual and environment, a conflict that is also no longer a sexual conflict. These are implications of what Freud in 1920, a year later, considers an extreme line of thought that he cannot no longer fully accept. The way out of these implications and problems is presented in the 1920 published version of the text, the introduction of the concepts of the life drives and the death drives, in chapter 6. First part of this chapter is by and large a lengthy discussion of August Weismann's thesis of the potentially immortal germ plasm, which, if this thesis were true, would imply that death is a late acquisition in the course of evolution, with the appearance of multicellular organisms. The same would be true for reproduction through the coalescence of cells. This would mean that the sexual drives would also have to be considered late acquisitions. After all, why would a potential immortal organism or germ cell have a drive for the prolongation of life through reproduction? And if unicellular organisms can rejuvenate and lose nothing of their original vitality, and if death is a late acquisition of organisms, what would be the argument for assuming that there must have been death drives from the beginning of life on this earth? These are the questions that Freud raises. The problem that Weismann's theory poses is how to think the fundamental characteristics of the drives. Freud's argumentations in his discussion with Weismann aim at the dismissal of Weismann's theory of potential immortality and lead to the conclusion that no biological theory stands in the way of assuming that the life drives and the death drives are the fundamental forces in organic life from the very origin. It is only after this discussion that Freud makes a bold attempt to another step forward, as he calls it. And this step does not in the first place consist of the introduction of the death drives, but the concept of the life drives. It is worthwhile quoting the crucial passage at the beginning of the introduction of this new drive concept. I quote, "It is generally considered that the union of a number of cells into a vital association has become a means for prolonging their lives. One cell helps to preserve the life of another, and the community of cells can survive even if individual cells have to die. We have already heard that conjugation, too, the temporary coalescence of two unicellular organisms, has a life-preserving and rejuvenating effect on both of them. Accordingly, we might attempt to apply the libido theory, which has been arrived at in psychoanalysis, to the mutual relationship of cells. The new drive theory, Freud argues, is based on an application of the libido theory to cells. More concrete, it is the study of group psychology and the processes of binding individuals to communities that Freud has in mind here. Cells behave like individuals. An organ and a body are communities of interacting individual cells. The body is like a nation state. It is a large cell state composed of individual cells. Again, it is from the psychoanalytic knowledge of, in this case, processes of binding in groups that Freud seeks to contribute to biology and evolutionary theory. The introduction of the life drives marks an important and radical shift in his position in the text. With the concept of the life drives, Freud does no longer maintain that all change and what evolutionary biologists would call progress should be explained from traumatic external stimuli. Change is no longer the sole effect of enforced modifications. And even when Freud argues that the life drives have to be thought of as being conservative and seeking to restore an original lost unity, the focus is on the life drives as an inner vital principle that through their aim of binding continuously produce new life forms. Freud underscores this in later statements. The aim of the life drives is to form living substances in ever greater unities, so that life may be prolonged and brought to higher development. They are an internal impulse towards progress. In the second version of the text, Freud thus presents the life drives as the true modifying forces in phylogeny and ontogeny. The final conclusion Freud draws can be found in editions from 1925. If the life drives are the motive forces that push forward towards progress in the production of new forms, it is impossible to maintain that all drives are conservative, regressive, and restorative. Beyond the pleasure principle, there is something. It is the life drives. It is eros. Our monograph, Seduction, Drive, and Repetition, does not end with a discussion of beyond the pleasure principle. The final chapter is devoted to Moses and monotheism. We argue that this text can be read as Freud's final case study, a case study not of an individual, but of the individuality or identity of a whole people. At the heart of this text, we find again the concept of trauma, the traumatic impact of the murder of Moses. Why did this murder have such an impact? And to what effect? First of all, this study is largely about the effects, nachträglich, afterwards, on the gradual change of character of a whole people over a period of about 800 years. In other words, it is a reconstruction of the significance of a single accidental factor in the history of a people. But this impact cannot be understood without taking into account a constitutional factor. The murder of Moses is a partial repetition of the primal murder of the father. Freud's last major study is again an inquiry into the complemental series of accidental and constitutional factors from which one can reconstruct and understand the derailments and pathological traits of, in this case, a whole people and their tragic history. Okay, I leave it here. I think in terms of the time, that would be good. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
No, thank you so much, Herman, for your speech. I gonna immediately invite Leonardo to comment on your talk, and we can discuss a little bit more afterwards.
Yeah.
Leonardo, please.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. And I have so many thoughts. I just need some time to gather them, to put them together. But multiple questions I have. One thing I'm really been interested in your work, and not just this book, but in your introduction, you have a whole section that it's about methodology. But this is I would say, a common thread in your work before, and as I understand, also your book on the Beyond the Pleasure Principle is a kind of reading of Freud that I think it might be helpful. I am interested in it, and I think it will probably be helpful for everyone here to kind of hear that coming from your mouth. Exactly how do you see Freud methodologically? How one should read Freud?
How one should read Freud. Shall I immediately go into this question?
Yeah, I think it's a good point to start.
Yeah. I think we should take a few aspects of Freud's work and also of his ideas very serious. One thing is that maybe to start at the other end of the answer, that Freud, in his work, regularly criticizes philosophy and all kinds of, let's say, philosophical or quasi.
Did you freeze? Was it just me, or
Yes.
is it frozen for everybody?
Yes.
Oops.
Let's wait a little bit to see if he defreezes.
Philosophical attempts also within his own science.
Oh, Herman, you were frozen for maybe a minute, and you just got back.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Okay,
but
so in
essentially, I think you have to start from the beginning again.
I start from the beginning.
Yeah,
I
because
think we have to.
missed one.
In answer to your question, I think we have to take serious a few elements of Freud's writings, and the first one I would like to mention is that Freud, at various occasions in his writings, criticizes philosophy, distances himself from philosophy, and also from his own followers who want to develop psychoanalysis into a quasi-philosophy, or because Freud has problems with developing a consistent and coherent theory that would in the end prove to be quite dogmatic. So all his references to philosophy are about the problem of a kind of consistent, coherent theory that is, as it were, put into concrete, put into stone, can no longer be further developed. Right? The idea and he sometimes also associates it with a paranoid delusional system in which everything has its set place, but in which no development can take place at the same time. So that's one argument, and I think against that argument there is a fundamental intuition, and it comes from a clinical practice, I'm sure, that you need to have that every clinical case, and it's not by coincidence that there are so many clinical cases in Freud's work, references to clinical practice, that every clinical case also incites or produces new theoretical reflections. Right? What you find in Freud's work, I think, is exactly this, not really an attempt to create coherent and consistent theory, but to show the points at which psychoanalysis becomes, when theoretical and clinical insights of clinical material becomes the material for theorizing. So I would say Freud's work is a form of theorizing without creating theory, right? And theory in the sense of a coherent, consistent theoretical body that is more or less stable. And I think this is something that you can see in many of his key writings, in which so I would say this helps me to understand why, and in itself it's a puzzling question, why in Freud's many key writings he does not consider a rewriting of the text, but adds material in a way that the text becomes contradictory, or that he adds statements that undermine previous positions. It happens in Free Essays, it happens in the Wolfman case, it happens in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, it happens in Moses and Monotheism, in these great texts in which he has first versions, second versions, new editions, etc. There's always this questioning of his own theoretical concepts and his own trains of thought, up to points where he says, well, I cannot maintain this, I have to move in another direction, I have to choose another path, I bring in a new conceptuality in order to move in a different direction. And he lets that standing. I think this, for me, this is one of the puzzling questions when dealing with Freud's work and these various versions. Why did he never fundamentally rewrite a text? The Moses text is a good example, right? I mean, he has a first version from 1934, and then he has the version from 1938, and they partly harmonize, partly do not. There's a shift of attention and a shift of focus. And then he does not really decide not to include the first version in the final version, but he says, I wrote this in 1934. It's in the text that he says this. I wrote this in 1934. I didn't want to throw it away. I thought it was important. I included it anyway. I present it as a summary and repetition, but it's not. And this is intriguing. Why do you do this? Well, because I think you want to resist having a kind of a dogmatic theory, or you want to resist the actual making of a grand theory and keep open all the different possibilities and trains of thought that might be useful, helpful, insightful, and etc. I think it's very honest. It's also very transparent. I think it's fundamentally very psychoanalytic, but it's something that you hardly find in any other author, that you would have such clear examples of texts in which the author contradicts himself or corrects himself or raises so fundamental questions to his own ideas and premises and then introduces something else. I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but
yeah,
is it an answer to your question?
I find this constant, and you make a call here to the reader about, I guess, like our tendency to kind of seek coherence, or to look for coherence in Freud's work, as if like we, historians and scholars in general read Freud's text as if there was like a whole body, a whole coherent body that unfolds throughout time, and as if there is a point at which things coalesce together. And you're saying like, no, this conflict is in every one of his works, all his major works. Is constantly Freud is constantly dialoguing and in conflict with himself. And you can read that through the analysis of the different editions. Like those conflicts come to emerge from that.
Yeah, and that makes his text, I think, philosophically very, very interesting and fruitful, because in that way the text becomes not an attempt to create psychoanalytic dogma by saying, for example, well, here we have a few pillars or shibboleths of psychoanalytic theory. This is the Oedipus complex, boom. Here we have another aspect, the drive theory. We set that is in place. Everything can be built upon these pillars, and we have a beautiful, coherent, and consistent theory. That's not very interesting in itself. I mean, this is the way that a lot of, let's say, secondary literature has reviewed Freud. But Freud, I think, becomes much more interesting if you read him as an author who is much more interested in exploring a set of questions and problems, or what Deleuze would call a problematics, without giving a definitive answer, but at the same time being rigorous enough to explore some of the implications of certain premises and arguments, up to a point where he can no longer accept them, or they become almost ridiculous. That sometimes also happens. But that is what makes his work, I think, so interesting. It is open, and it therefore is also very productive, not only for Freud, but also for the reader.
I certainly agree with you. And if I'm allowed to continue here a little bit, so now getting a little bit more on the subject matter of the text. So we have Freud. I read Freud in a certain way as he's constantly trying to bridge over a series of dichotomies, internal and external, experience and inheritance,
Mhm,
uh, drive and drive and trauma,
mhm,
endogenous, exogenous, and
mhm,
constantly trying to bridge these dichotomies in interesting and sometimes quite fantastic ways.
mhm.
Fantastic in the sense of like pure fantasy, I feel like kind of a bit nuts, but like it still makes it interesting, an interesting read. Uh, and and I think a lot of what you're talking about here, it's about uh, uh, this dichotomy experience, which is uh, you kind of try to trace a history a little bit of this dichotomy in the concept of the dynamics of trauma and drive, uh, and and your reading is very like internalistic. It's like about internal developments in Freudian history,
False.
uh,
Yeah.
Freudian thought. Um, I also would add some externalistic readings to that as well, and I'll be curious to see to what extent you would concur, agree, or disagree on those. But I see Freud as like as a very first period in Freud when he first becomes a medical doctor. He's still a medical doctor in his trainings. He's still working at the hospital in the 1880s at the Allgemeines, the General Hospital in Vienna. Uh, that's his first paper on hysteria. I even forgot the name because I always forget what is it. It's the 1886
Mhm,
observation of a severe case of hemianesthesia in a hysterical male. And there he has no problem with, and this case it's published in 86, but was written before.
mhm,
And he has no problem with inheritance there. And it's a very typical paper of like kind of psychiatry, the generation theory, and there's nothing about that's problematic for him there. Uh, but then his work becomes increasingly more focused on experience and trauma later on. In the late 80s to 1990s. Yeah. And
mhm.
then, like, as it comes to the late 1890s, then there's another turn there. That's when he does the I no longer believe my neurotica, but you're saying it's not an abandonment of experience, is an attempt to reconciliate them.
Yeah.
But it's but he goes fully on the trauma theory. He goes from fully accepting the generation theory, uh, inheritance, hysteria is inherited and constitutional, to know hysteria is experience and trauma in the late 1880s, to then no, there's also fantasy, there's drive. In 1897 is when the first time he uses the term drive, right? So there's a turn again to internal factors and endogenous factors and to fantasy and so on and so forth. Um, I read this as his encounter with anti-Semitism. I think that to a large extent, he goes to Paris in 1886, 1885, 86. Charcot um, has a predominantly inherited theory of hysteria. Also, there's the agent provocateur, but like that's just the precipitating factor. hysteria is a constitutional disease, is predominantly found in Jewish families. He'll also say he builds like family trees of Jewish families. There is a book that comes out in France in that year, 1896, by Edouard Drummond called like La France Juive, France.
Mhm.
And it becomes kind of the argument for like, oh no, hysteria is predominantly Jewish, predominantly found in Jewish families. And then Freud encounters this, and there is also the increasing anti-Semitism in Vienna at that time, in the late 1880s. He encounters some experiences of anti-Semitism at the hospital at that time, personal experiences. And so he's against constitutional theories. He has a turn in the 1880s against constitutional theories of hysteria. But then he goes back in the 1890s again. But he goes back in an attempt to kind of like mediate between them. I'll say if you to some extent agree with that kind of reading, and or how else would you read these terms, especially in the early Freud?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for this question. First remark: before Freud wrote his papers on hysteria, he wrote papers on zoology. So there is already in the first papers these wonderful papers on eels and shellfish, etc. Nobody reads it, but they are of course also part of Freud's development, and of course from that period, and also as a medical student, he is of course first he knows all the literature that he is discussing and using in the various texts, including Beyond the Pleasure Principle. That's the first remark. So he goes from zoology to neurology, and then from neurology to psychoanalysis. That's clear. I agree with you that to a large extent in the 1880s and also the 1890s, the discussion is first and foremost with Charcot. Right? In the first papers on hysteria, I think Freud tries his best to be as Charcotian as possible. And indeed, he has in those texts at first sight, the first text, probably no real problems with Charcot's intuitions. That is, there is the agent provocateur, there is the shock, that is the agent provocateur. The actual cause of the hysteria is a constitutional one. In the end, that's a matter of degeneration or inherited neurological weakness, or whatever you would call it. And then but Charcot also already has this first intuitions about psychological and sociological factors that play a role. And the psychological factor is, of course, connected to the research on hypnosis, that you can artificially create hysterical symptoms. So this is where the psychological aspects comes in, and hypnosis is important in this context in the late 1880s and 1890s, because it convinces Freud of the importance of the psychological aspect above the constitutional one. Or if there is a constitutional one, it must be thought in a different way, and not in terms of degeneration or any form of a neuropathic disposition. And I think in the 1890s, the discussion then becomes more complicated, because it's not only Charcot that is in the background of his thinking, but also the confrontation with people like Krafft-Ebing. So the first discussions with people from the Viennese psychiatric environment and the broader psychiatric movement. So no longer only neurology, but also psychiatry comes into the discussion. As I said, I think there was, at the moment, Freud realizes that you cannot have from a pure psychological theory, you cannot explain all the aspects of the etiology of the psychoneuroses. He had to you could say there was no other alternative then again to look at constitutional and hereditary factors, but different from what the psychiatrists at that time were doing and different from what Charcot had been arguing, namely in the end, a theory of degeneration that is in the background. So then to develop an own theory of what will be the sexual constitution in 3 essays. I think that Freud first wanted Fliess to do that, actually, but Fliess didn't deliver. And then I think Freud decided, okay, if Fliess doesn't do it, then I do it myself. And so that's what he did. I'm not convinced by the reference to anti-Semitism, though. I think there is little evidence in the text from that period that this is for Freud a major concern or a major argument or a major issue. I think, of course, you're right that Freud, throughout his whole career, was confronted with anti-Semitism, and certainly also around 1900 in the Vienna of Karl Lueger, that was a pressing issue. It was also a hindrance in his academic career, as we know, so it is playing a role in Freud's personal life and in his, let's say, in his career. But I think that the way that his theory develops is very much based on the discussions with the neurological and the psychiatric literature of the time. And it is for theoretical reasons that Freud takes a few turns, so to speak, and decisive turns in his work. I would not relate that to too many, let's say, cultural influences. And if, then I would say probably more than only the anti-Semitism, but a larger cultural context in which certain phenomena are found interesting to pursue or interesting to explore. So this is an answer to your question. I mean, in general, I think you're right. There are several decisive moments in this period, the 1880s, 1890s, decisive for the further development of theory. But I would say they are mostly in discussion, in a very close discussion with the neurologist and the psychiatrist of his time.
Now, if I'm allowed to make one last question, and connecting with the beyond the pleasure principle, and it's a connected question here, but like pushing to the beyond the pleasure principle. It's the a similar question is about determinism and indeterminism in Freud, and when he turns in the late 1890s, and he makes this constitutional turn back to the inner and to fantasy and to drive, he articulates drive in a very different way, like in a very non-deterministic way, I would say. And I think it's a lot of your points on your essays. That's not just the one in the book. There's also all the papers on the 3 essays of sexuality. Mm-hmm. But you make the case that Freud was conceiving a very non-deterministic view of sexuality and of drive and so on and so forth in his early work. So he's conceiving this drive as a disposition to act. A disposition is not a determination. The disposition, as he understands it there, it's sort of a movement, but it's a movement without an object. It's a movement without an aim, without finality. There's no outer teleology there, except for the seeking of pleasure itself. Yeah. But then you have the late beyond the pleasure principle, where his language on drive becomes very different and very deterministic at this point. So then drives are no longer described as a disposition to act, but as an urge to act, as a drug. Drives are not open, but they are a source of compulsion. They're a zwang to wiederholung. So like the language that he uses is actually the same language that Albert Moll early on was using to describe drive, and Krafft Ebing, and he was against it. So he reverts to that kind of language to describe drive in a very deterministic way. And see how you understand their story.
Yeah, that's an intriguing question and a good observation, by the way, because I think you're right. With nuances, I would say. So I think you are right that I think the first introduction of the drive and the first elaborations on drive are actually in the Free Essays in 1905, and he uses the concept and the first definition in 1905, he immediately deletes it in the version of 1915 and substitutes it for another definition that is more or less the same that you find in the text on drives and their vicissitudes. So you see that already in the early writings, Freud is, so this very first definition from 1905, he immediately drops it. And one of the reasons, I think, is because of the discussion with Jung, who exactly pointed at the Achilles heel of Freud's theory, namely that Freud did not really have a theory of the drives in the first place. And Jung thought, okay, I can do better, and came up with an idea that was actually based on an exegesis of Freud's Free Essays. So Jung took an idea of a possible reading of the Free Essays theory of the drives and developed it into its own theory, and then Freud suddenly realized, oh, but this is something else than what I was intending, and he further develops his theory. So that's one element. You're right. The theory of the drives, the way that Freud first introduces, is very slim. It's not theoretically elaborated. It's a very simple definition. There's something of an organic impulse that when it touches upon a sensitive body part, it can become sexual, or it creates sexual excitation. That's basically it. It's a rather general description, similar to a stimulus, I would say, almost, and not very dramatic. Right? It is as if there is some itching in the body and some excitation, and that's it. Nothing spectacular. Of course, in the background, at the same time, there is a complex history. I think you're right. He takes the concept from the psychiatric literature and the sexological literature. Krafft Ebing uses it. Moll uses it. All these other guys in that context use the term drive. But the term drive also already he must have known this, is also part of the evolutionary biological literature. It has a prehistory in German idealism. So there's a very complicated history already before Freud of the drive concept. You're right that in the course of his writings, Freud tries to elaborate more on the drive concept. He does so in Drive and their vicissitudes, and then also in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. And there the notion of aim, as you rightfully mentioned, the compulsive aspect, the urge or the aim, also life aims at death, right? A strong idea of aim. It's also a teleological definition, although the telos is not in the future but in the past. But nevertheless, this idea is stronger developed. It becomes more deterministic. At the same time, this is also, if you look at the Free Essays, the same period in which he more and more develops a developmental perspective on sexuality, as if there is already always predetermined in an individual a certain sexual development towards a certain end, right? Adult sexuality becomes the final form of what would be the normal development of sexuality. And so this idea that, so this developmental perspective that he brings into his theory of sexuality also, it can also be seen, I think, in the theory of the drives that more and more also include this notion of, yes, it cannot only be about ticklings and itchings in the body. There must be something of an aim. There must be something of a direction towards which the drives strive, if not satisfaction, well, mostly it defines in terms of satisfaction, but or an alternative to that. I think there are a few parallel developments here in the theory of sexuality and the theory of the drives that lead Freud to lay more emphasis on the notion of aim, right? And I think, as I said, this is also part of the three essays of the theory of sexuality. The first version, infantile sexuality, no object, no aim. But in the course of the various versions, you see that progressively the object and the aim are brought into infantile sexuality. And then you get more this developmental perspective in which there is a certain normal course in the normal development of drives, and then the element of aim becomes more important and more underscored. So I think you're right. This is a development in Freud's thinking. At the same time, I think beyond the pleasure principle, if you take serious all the references to drive and drive theory in the text, you probably end up with about 4 or 5 drive theories, at least. Which also provides the possibility for nuancing, I think, every too over-deterministic approach to the drives, right? The aim of life is death. If we take that, the aim of life is death. If we take that also as describing something of the drives, okay, that's a clear aim. But then the life drives, eros, it does not aim at death. There's an aim at production, at larger unities that goes in another direction. It's another aim. So in that sense, Freud undermines the attempts to be too, let's say, certain or dogmatic about what the aim of the drive would exactly be. The aim of eros is also not satisfaction in the strict sense, because eros produces turmoil and excitation in the process of creating larger unities. So there is on the one hand, you're right, there is this tendency to focus more on the aim of the drives and to make this an important aspect. And at the same time, Freud undermines his own ideas on what exactly that aim would be. Does that make sense? What I'm saying?
Yeah. Another conflict.
Another conflict.
Another internal conflict.
Yeah, we can talk about aim, Freud would say, but we have to consider the question: what kind of aim is it? And then he comes up with very different ideas, actually.
Okay, gotta wait for your next book to come out.
Well, I think that what is also very helpful, I know that Richard also wrote on Beyond the Pleasure Principle and also explored all the theories from evolutionary biology and from physics that are in the background of Freud's reasoning, and also his thinking about drives in particular as force or as energy or as urge.
Yeah, but what I did was more historical work, more than philosophical. It was more trying to an archaeology of Freud's sources more than anything else. And just because I thought that this was mostly disregarded in the studies about beyond the pleasure principle, most of them. I would have tons of questions and topics to discuss, but I think I'm going to refrain myself and save them for another day. Because of the time limitations. But before we finish, I don't know, like if it's some people from the audience who have some brief questions, we have some, we can save some time for them. If not, I can make some final comments to our panel. Are there someone from the audience would you like to ask some brief questions to Herman? Well, anyway, just to conclude, it's not to conclude, but more into the philosophical side. I think it's very interesting that you contrarily to is we find more often in psychoanalytic literature. You and Felipe, you argue against the idea that one needs to free Freud's idea of from constitutional factors and reference to phylogeny, to biology, to make it anthropologically and philosophically relevant, and not only relevant but also revolutionary and radical. I think it's very because most often you find out Freud has some crazy ideas about biology, some crazy idea about inheritance. We can leave that aside and focus on what really matters is a language, culture, and other stuff. So we'd like to kind of just to finish, just a final remark. What kind of anthropology you find because this is something that struck me. Of course, this is this very intriguing idea. Of course, Freud is involved in this kind of speculations about the origins of life, which is typical from the science of his time, biological science of his time. And you said you synthesized the idea, life itself is traumatized matter, but mostly humans are traumatized animals. It's very interesting because it points to a kind of recurrent theme in philosophical anthropology that humans are imperfect animals. Humans are a kind of sick animal or an incomplete animal. The young Hegel saying that the unit of the animal is the coming to being of spirit. It is kind of so. In a certain way, from a historical point of view, not from the history of science, but from history of philosophy, you present Freud as a kind of philosophical anthropology that kind of presents another version of this anthropological topic. You can understand what a human being is if you understand this as a kind of imperfect or incomplete or sick of traumatized animal. And I'm curious about how you would situate this anthropological reading of Freud within this broader philosophical context.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question. I think that's wonderful, and it's good that I can make a few comments on it. I think that so to think about what it means when Freud thinks the human being or actually all organic life from the perspective of trauma, and then the interaction between constitutional and accidental factors in the etiology of the neuroses, but also as decisive for the development of every human being. What does it mean? It means that Freud understands, I think in the end, it means that Freud understands the human being in terms of inner conflict. I think that is the bottom line. So what does it mean to say that the human being is a traumatized animal or a sick animal? It means that the human life and the human organism and the history of the species of the humanoids is a tragic history, and that life has a tendency to tragedy because of the inner conflicts that are, in fact, you could say, constitutional. The Free Essays is a good example. Sexuality yes, there is excitation, yes, there's pleasure, but there are also immediately the spontaneous reaction formations of disgust and shame, guilt. So there is an inner conflict, and we are an inner conflictuous being, and we don't need an environment in order to have that conflict. So the conflict for Freud is not that between the individual and the environment, or between the individual and the symbolic order, or a law of the father. There's always already an inner conflict or a potential of inner conflict. Given the human constitution, this is the importance of the drive dualism, by the way. Why two drives? Because Freud fundamentally conceives the human being as a being in conflict. And this somewhat further defines the sickness. So the sickness is also not lack. It's also not something that you miss. It is actually much more something that you have in excess, right? The problems emerge when when the inner conflict is too strong. That is when the drive forces are too strong, or when the components in the conflict are too strong. I'm on this point, I'm a little bit more on the side of Deleuze than on Lacan, I would say. So sickness not as lack, but sickness as excess and as conflict. And I think this element of conflict gives Freud his own position, I think, within a larger philosophical anthropology. I mean, I think that is the most fundamental aspect of Freudian thinking, and not to think, because this is what happened in a lot of post-Freudian literature, think of Marcuse, but also Lacan, I would say, to a certain extent. The conflict, or Girard, the conflict is the major conflict. That what gives a human being a tragic character is that between the individual and its environment, the cultural systems that one is living in, or the natural environment that is the hostile environment, etc. But for Freud, it's enough to be alone, to be tragic. And I think that is what Freud, I think, would add to the fundamental insight that Freud adds to philosophical anthropology in the first place.
I totally agree. I think Freud doesn't seem to think this incompleteness in terms of negativity or something in the dialectical sense of the word, and neither in terms of the same argument can be made to push the theory towards more traditional anthropological views. Since the animal human lacks something, so something different must fill this void. And this something is the symbolic culture, language, and so forth. And it's not that doesn't seem to be Freud's view. No. And
it's also not a theory in which this lack is the pushing factor in something of progress in culture, right? It is because we have a sense of lack that we strive to complete ourselves, and that would be the driving force in our cultural evolution. That's also not the point that Freud is making.
Yeah. And when you think about very early on, Freud thinks, for example, one of this figure of this kind of incomplete animality is prematurity at birth. And Freud refers to it very early on in the Project for Scientific Psychology. And he says, the prematurity of the newborn is the source of all moral motives. So to make is that a positive role it plays? We have morals because we are premature beings at birth, and we are always biologically incomplete beings towards our life. And later on, it finds about inhibition, anxiety, reasserts the idea that prematurity is the crucial biological factor in mental functioning, not only in neurosis. So it's very so Anyway, I would just like to ask again if we have some questions from the audience. If not, I think or Leonardo, if not, I think we can call it a day. Okay. And then I would like to, Herman, thank you so much. Really thank for your brilliant speech. I also Leonardo for the comments and
Yes.
debate, and of course for all the audience for our its presence here. I can't recommend too much the book. I put a link to it in the chat. I had the opportunity to read most of it before this, so I can recommend it too much. I think it's a very original and sophisticated reading of not only of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, but the development of Freud thinking in its from the end to the beginning to the end.
Yes.
So I think that's it. I think, Herman, I hope we have the opportunity to talk
Oh yes, sure.
again. And
I hope so.
this is it.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all for
Thank you.
attending. Thank you.
So this is it, folks. That's all, folks. As I
Thank
say,
you, everyone.
Merry Melodies.
Thank you. Thank you, Leonardo. Bye.
Thank you.